Hey swarmers, welcome back to The Hive. Today we are here with William Klimpert from Common Ground Compost in New York City to talk waste, compost, and sustainability. Thanks for being here, William.
Thanks for having me.
I can't wait to learn more about what you do and all of the great things you have to say. So can you start with a little background about yourself and how you eventually got working with Common Ground Compost here in New York?
Absolutely. So I have been working in the compost field for about 6 years now. I went to college to become a physicist. I did not become a physicist.
Great.
While I was studying in college, I was trying to find something to do, like an extracurricular. And
Sure.
I walk into this room, and it's just a bunch of these kids sitting around on, like, the tops of desks. Mm-hmm. And they just go, "We're the compost people. We hang out. Sometimes we compost. It's chill." And I'm
You're
like, these are my people. This
Yeah.
is it.
Amazing.
So that's how I got into compost. So I came for the people, I came for the community, and stayed for the compost because my first time turning this compost pile with my pitchfork, I'm like, this is amazing. So I was sold. So since then, I had been working with the university and community organizations on different compost projects. And a little over a year ago, I started working with Common Ground Compost. First, just as a compost hauler. We have a program where we will bike around Manhattan and we'll just pick up compost from residents, restaurants, schools, sometimes office spaces, anyone who wants to compost. And so that's how I got in with Common Ground Compost.
So can you tell us a little bit more about, you're the data guy, right? What is it that you do there? What does that mean?
One of the big things I'm doing is just trying to find out how to collect information that we want, that would be valuable for us to find out how we're doing, how sustainable are we, and to give back to our clients so that they can know what they're doing is actually making a difference.
Can you tell us a little bit about the history of compost in New York City?
So New York has been composting for a long time. We're not new to this by any measure. So I think that the New York Compost Project was started in the early 90s, I think 1993, and it's still going now. And their whole purpose was to raise awareness about compost. And so one of the first things that came with that was the master composting class. And so what that is people throughout the city, all 5 boroughs of New York, can take this class, I think twice a year, and they end up as master composters, basically stewards, so that once they have that information about the science behind composting and how to build your own compost system and the recipe for compost and all of that great stuff, once they become experts on compost, the idea is that then they'll spread that information. They'll keep sharing that with other people. They'll start their own community gardens, and the movement will just expand from there. So in 2013, the brown bin system, which is New York City's Curbside compost pickup program, was started. And that basically works like your trash or recycling bin in your apartment. So the city will give you this brown bin, true to its name, and that'll go out right with your trash and recycling, and they'll come around with trucks every week and they'll pick it up just like anything else. So even in a building that has a bin for compost, they might not know what compost is, or they might just be scared of it. So there's that stigma around compost that plenty of people throughout the city are working to kind of remove.
Yeah.
All of this work around compost that the city has been doing, that's where Common Ground Compost came from. So the founder of Common Ground Compost, Laura Rosenshine, started in the early 2010s. She started as a consulting business. So working with schools and office spaces and all of these entities around the city who wanted an expert to be able to tell them what they should be doing, what do they need to know. And after working as a consultant and getting this information to people, Laura started our compost pickup program in, I think, 2014. And that's been growing since then. And so since then, we've had a branch of Common Ground Compost called Reclaimed Organics that has been a bicycle-powered compost micro-hauler, which is a mouthful, but I think they're all cool. All of the parts of that
are wonderful.
Yeah.
There's sort of this reservation about composting. Can you talk about that? Is that like an ew factor?
Exactly. It's an ew factor. So a lot of folks who don't have experience around compost, who haven't, grown up in families who composted, or even grown up in families that were really stringent about recycling, may not really understand what this is or why they should be doing it, why this matters at all.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of misconceptions around compost, and I think that a lot of this comes from the fact that most people, when they think of food waste, they just think, ew, there was something gross in my fridge. That's something I have to throw out. So nobody who hasn't been composting really has any positive experiences with food waste. So we're going in and we're saying, we bring up food waste, and there's already this negative connotation there.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot of confusion about rats, especially in New York City, where rodents are a huge concern. And so what I see a lot, especially from residential buildings and landlords, is a concern that having a bin just for food waste is going to attract rodents. And wildly, that's exactly not what's happening. So in fact, it's the opposite. Because right now, so one of the reasons New York is kind of as smelly as it is, all of our trash goes out in bags, just on the side of the street. If we weren't composting, all of that food would just be in easily nibbleable bags. But instead, with this brown bin program and with community gardens and all of that, all of our food goes into these big, rigid, hard-to-chew-through containers. So what we've seen is they actually deter rodents.
Composting, let's talk about it, logistically. What is it? What can you compost? Tell us about it.
Yes.
You're excited.
Yes, I'm so excited. I love compost, which, I wouldn't be here if I didn't.
Yeah.
So compost is the coolest. Let's start there.
Cool.
So compost is what happens when we take our organic waste, our food scraps, our napkins, paper towels, little wooden bits, all of this stuff that is organic. It came from nature, and bringing it back to nature. So what we're doing with that, all of that organic waste, all of those food scraps, is we put them in this pile, and we make sure that oxygen gets into that pile. And that's the most important thing about compost. That's the big difference between compost and a landfill. In a landfill, our food is still going to break down, but it's going to firstly break down very slowly, because nothing is happening in a landfill. And secondly, it's going to break down without oxygen. There's no air going through that landfill. And when food breaks down without oxygen, the bacteria that are eating it will release methane, which is a greenhouse gas that's by most counts about 28 times as potent as CO2. So it's not great. And it's hugely detrimental for the global climate crisis that we're in right now. And when you look at the fact that most of our landfills are filling up with food waste, and landfills are, I think, about 18% of all of the U.S.'s methane emissions, we have a huge problem here.
Sure do.
So going back to compost then, the big difference with compost is we're making sure that oxygen gets in there. And there are a few different ways to do that. You can either have a compost pile and take pitchforks and just toss it around like a salad. Sometimes people will have an ASP bin, an aerated static pile, where there will be a pipe that goes through it that pumps air in. sometimes you'll have one of these tumblers, and that motion of turning it around and tumbling all the compost is what gets the air in. Whatever the case, when bacteria break down food with oxygen, they don't release methane. And what happens then is all of the nutrients in the food get released out of that and turn into basically this natural fertilizer. It's really a soil amendment, but for all intents and purposes, it's like a fertilizer. And that fertilizer can be used by community gardeners, people with potted plants, farmers, anybody who has plants.
Yeah.
And that's the great thing about compost. It pushes us towards the circular economy.
Yeah.
So the idea here is that someone has produced this food. We buy the food, we eat as much of it as we can, and then we're finding a way to increase the value of the scraps left over. We're taking what was trash, and we're finding a way to cycle it back into the economy so that somebody will want it. Somebody can use the nutrients that are left in my apple core, and I'd like to make sure that it gets to them.
It's such a beautiful cycle. It goes right back to the original source.
Yeah.
It's like the definition of sustainability, self-sustaining. That's amazing.
Absolutely.
So food scraps, coffee grounds,
Yes. So
wood chips, anything of that nature, put it in the compost bin.
Well, so an important point about that, an important caveat here.
Yeah.
Exactly what you can compost depends a lot on where you're composting.
Okay.
So technically, all of this organic matter will compost just fine in any compost system you have.
Okay, yeah.
But if you're composting in your house or in, say, a community garden, typically you won't be able to compost meat, bones, dairy, seafood, anything with grease on it. And that's mostly because all of these things can cause a smell. And they have to be good neighbors in your house or in these community gardens. So they need to make sure that they're being responsible with what's there. They need to make sure that there's no smell coming out there, that there aren't rodents being attracted there.
I see.
And also with meat, in your home compost system or a community garden, typically these piles don't get hot enough for long enough for any pathogens in the meat to completely break down and, be neutralized.
Right.
So the other side of things is a big industrial compost facility. These giant facilities, they usually use something called windrows, which are just these big kind of Toblerone-shaped piles of compost. And what's going on chemically is really exactly the same as what's happening in a home compost system or a community garden. But the difference there is they have the resources to devote to making sure that their compost is working perfectly. They can keep it aerated all the way throughout. They can make sure that the pH is right, the moisture is right, everything is just right on there so that they'll have perfect compost. And because of that, they can compost all of this organic matter that you have, all of your fruit and vegetable scraps, just like a community garden, as well as meat, bones, dairy, seafood, grease, all of that. Typically, compost rules are pretty much the same wherever you go. Aside from the scale of compost, whether you're at this small-scale home or community garden or a large-scale industrial compost facility, everything else is pretty standard.
Yeah.
In my house, whether I'm in New York or Washington State or wherever, if I made my own compost pile in my backyard, I'd be able to compost fruits, vegetable scraps, all of the same stuff. So it's one thing that I like about compost is that it's actually pretty simple. And once you learn the rules, you know them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's universal. It's organic materials. Doesn't get simpler than that, which is great. Can you tell us where all of this compost ends up?
What a great question. So, it really depends on the scale. The nice thing about community gardens is if you're composting in one of their piles, you know exactly where it's ending up. It's staying right there.
Yeah.
With the brown bin system, it goes a lot of different places. So drop-off locations around New York City will usually be hosted by different entities in different boroughs. In Brooklyn, the drop-off locations are hosted by the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. In Manhattan, it's hosted by the Lower East Side Ecology Center. And they, the long way that they say it is they are the Department of Sanitation compost project hosted by the Lower East Side Ecology Center.
Okay, cool.
And with these drop-off locations, they'll take as much of that as they can in and process it in the city. The problem with Manhattan and the problem with New York City as a whole is that there's not a lot of space here. So it's really hard to make room for this giant compost facility where we could process everything.
Yeah.
So looking specifically at Common Ground Compost, we have a small little compost pile in a community garden in the East Village in Manhattan. And everything that we can, we process there. Because the more local you can keep your compost, the better.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons. It reduces your vehicle miles traveled so that this compost doesn't have to get on a truck and travel, many miles away. It also has a lot of community benefits, especially when people can see what's happening to their food waste. They can see how food becomes compost and they get a sense of that circular economy at work. I think it's really valuable when people get that whole picture instead of just throwing it into a bin and for all intents and purposes, it's just like trash, but someone told them to put it somewhere else.
Right. Yeah.
So a lot of compost, at least for us, we have to send out of the city because we just don't have space here. So in New York, a lot of compost goes up to McEnroe Farms, which is up in upstate New York, and they have a big facility there, and they can process a lot of it. Some food scraps coming out of New York City do go to an anaerobic digester instead of a compost pile. And what that really entails is that food scraps breaking down in an anaerobic digester will break down without oxygen, just like a landfill. Unlike a landfill, they'll capture the methane being released from them, and then that'll be used as a renewable energy.
Wow.
So this also has huge benefits.
Yeah.
And I think it's just nice for people to know that, if they're using the brown bin program from Department of Sanitation, a lot of those food scraps are going to a compost site, but some of them are going to an anaerobic digester.
I want to talk more specifically about Common Ground. And
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier you'll pick up from restaurants and you have forged these great relationships. And you also have a zero waste events service. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a tiny company that serves these three distinct roles. So as I've said before, we do have that compost pickup program. We are also consultants, and we also help put on zero waste events. So event coordinators will come to us and they'll say, I want my event to be zero waste. I want less than 10% of all of my waste going to a landfill. And we'll help them make that happen. So a lot of that comes in with helping them decide on purchasing, helping them set up infrastructure. And honestly, one of the most important parts of this is getting volunteers at these events to help people sort their waste. Because if we set up these waste stations where we have trash recycling and compost, and we have volunteers who know what they're doing to help guide people through the process, it can make this a lot easier and a lot less stressful for people.
Yeah.
So what I see a lot, when you don't have a system like that, is people can get overwhelmed pretty easily.
It's true.
They'll say, and then just throw everything in the trash.
It's so true.
And so we try to minimize that frustration from the process. And so I think it's an important thing to remember that sorting all of your waste properly is really hard. And it's not your fault.
Yeah.
What I see a lot is that people just get so frustrated with all of this, and they just think, I'm not doing this well enough, so I just won't do it at all.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the biggest problems that we see in particularly the waste field within sustainability.
That's a great idea to have a guide. Just if there was someone standing at every trash can in every public facility, that would be great.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the ideal right there. That peer-to-peer education.
Yeah.
No more problems if we had
Truly, it's invaluable. So, William, can you leave us with one, if you can narrow it down to one of your favorite tips for sustainability in general or composting? Leave our viewers with a good tip.
Yeah, I mean, just going simple on this, just try your best. So
I love that.
So, yeah, Meredith Damberg-Ficcarelli, the director of Common Ground Compost, once told me, we don't need one person living zero waste perfectly. We need everybody living zero waste imperfectly. Yes. And I think that goes a long way. Just taking little steps to try to reduce your footprint as much as fits into your budget and schedule and ability goes a long way. It's that collective action when everybody is making these small steps where we'll actually see a difference.
Couldn't agree more with that. It's so well said. It's about the collective. Thank you so much for being here, William. It's been so wonderful talking to you and learning so much about composting.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, thanks for joining us, Swarmers. If you guys have any tips yourself for composting, please share them in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.